if you do weatherization, that can usually cut down on 20 to 40% of the energy waste that you have for heating and cooling. It depends on how deep you go, right? If you're just insulating one part of your house, that may be on the lower end versus the higher end.
Welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview climate tech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. Today we have a really energetic, no pun intended, conversation with Andy Frank, the founder of Sealed. They are an energy efficiency company that pays for the infrastructure and then gets the upgrades installed and then gets paid back over time by their customer. They have an interesting model because they make more money the more money they're able to save for their customers. So they are incentivized to ensure they're actually creating a lot of energy savings. All kind of this an all-around energy efficiency play. So it's not just minor things. It's kind of the substantial home upgrades that require making this actually impactful. The really cool part to me about this conversation was as we walked through kind of how he built the company, the structure of the conversation was that we got into that a lot quicker than usual. So I think that's why I say it was a very energetic conversation, because it kept moving at a pretty good pace. And the most impactful advice that he shared was around speaking with your customers to understand what they need and what they will buy. There's a lot of other advice in there, but that was the most impactful thing on actually helping them to succeed in what they do. So with that, again, really exciting episode, really interesting episode, and he was a great guest to have on. I really hope you enjoy this episode as much as I do. All right, welcome to the show, Andy. How you doing?
I'm good, Silas. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super excited to have another original Midwesterner on the show. Let's get right into it. Let's start with your background. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into doing what you're doing.
So I grew up, as you alluded to, in the Midwest, outside of Chicago, the western suburbs of Chicago. And growing up, I would say I wasn't I've never been a tree hugger, hippie, anything like that. While I don't hate the outdoors, I'm definitely not like a hiker. I like my indoor days as well as my outdoor days. What I think really got me into the environmental space generally were a couple things. One, and I think this is not unique to me or to you or to others that are in this space, but just really understanding that climate change was going to be such an existential challenge, and really kind of the biggest challenge of our generation was very motivating. My dad was always kind of in and around the energy industry. He worked for the Gas Research Institute, worked for National Lab, and was kind of focused a lot on energy and environmental issues. So I was kind of surrounded by it growing up, but it wasn't like a big focus until I read this book, which is kind of a classic now, called Natural Capitalism, which is by Amory Lovins, who's the founder of the Rocky Mountain Institute, his wife at the time, Hunter Lovins, and Paul Hawken, who's another kind of just giant of the intellectual space that is kind of green capitalism. And it really both excited me and frustrated me, because it was all about how we can really improve both our economy and our environment at the same time, using kind of the general idea of resource efficiency, right? The idea is if we can use less inputs, right, and usually those are dirty inputs, to produce more stuff, that should be good for everyone, good for the planet, and good for kind of a sustainable future. But it was also very frustrating because it was kind of this idea of, why aren't we doing more of this, right? If resource efficiency and, energy efficiency in particular is so obvious and such a good thing to do, why aren't we doing it on a much greater scale? So I kind of started explore that question from a number of angles. In undergrad, I majored in environmental science and public policy, and really kind of looked at it from a scientific, economic, kind of political perspective. And I had one class, I think my senior year, that was particularly impactful to me, where one, it was great because there was no homework. We just basically every week had another expert come into the classroom and basically talk to us about different ways to mitigate climate change. So we talk about geothermal one week, and wind and solar and nuclear and carbon capture and sequestration and geoengineering, kind of everything that you see now and on a variety of fronts. And then the only thing we had to do for the semester was to basically create a version of a model and write a paper backing it up around how we were going to keep to, I don't even remember now, but let's call it 550 ppm of CO2, some sort of, kind of reasonable carbon limit, to avoid catastrophic climate change. And what really hit me in doing that were really two things. One was that we kind of had to do at least a little bit of everything, right? This is not kind of a silver bullet problem. It's, often referred to as silver buckshot. We have to, do all of these different clean energy and zero carbon technology solutions. But the second thing was that by far the biggest lever that we had was energy efficiency, right? Was the idea that we could do more while using less energy, and it was very sensitive. So if we can increase our energy productivity by a little bit, it meant that it was so much easier to reach our carbon goals than any of the other levers that we had at our disposal.
Hey there. Quick break to remind any founders or VCs listening, if you are looking for deal flow, seeking to raise funding, looking for partners to help service your needs, or perhaps you're looking for corporate investment partners, feel free to reach out to us through our Slack channel, which can be found in the description. Because we meet a lot of people in this space, we set aside time each week to make introductions to the various people that we encounter. This is something we do free of charge in order to help these incredible companies solving climate change to scale. Looking forward to hearing from you in the Slack channel.
So that kind of really motivated me in my career to really get into the business side of doing this, and happy to go through anything or everything that's helpful, that's instructive there. But basically, my kind of career has been really focused on how do you solve this puzzle, both kind of generally and then right now very specifically in the residential space, around driving resource efficiency in general and kind of energy efficiency and productivity in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's pretty fascinating to hear the kind of the origins there. Well, one thing I'm a little bit curious about, and I think this is maybe it's just a perception from somebody from the outside who's not building a climate tech company, but early on in your career, did you have pretty good clarity of purpose of what specifically you wanted to do in the long run? Did you know, hey, someday I want to build a company to solve this problem? Were you thinking, I want to just be in the business side of solving this energy efficiency thing? What was that like? And can you maybe highlight some of the moments that brought you a lot of clarity in actually understanding specifically which route you would take?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I didn't have a ton of clarity early on. Before I graduated college, I'd basically done nothing in business. I was kind of a political nerd, did some improv in undergrad, kind of just did this, that, and the other. But I kind of just became convinced from all the kind of research I'd done that really business and private capital was the key. So I wanted to really kind of learn what that looked like. So my first job out of college actually was working for a company that's actually not too far away from where I live now in Connecticut. It was basically a direct marketing company that sold a lot of things, but focused on selling like collectibles and like rare coins and stuff. And that helped me both kind of learn the fundamentals of business and margins and marketing and all that kind of stuff. And it also, very tactically helped me pay down student debt as well. So to be honest, I wasn't really thinking about starting a company when I had, tens of thousands of dollars of student debt coming out of college. So the first step was kind of learning business, paying off debt. But I didn't really expect to go into kind of the startup world. I think what really pushed me into that was getting a little bit of a taste of it in one of my early jobs, and then finding out that I really liked it, and finding that I kind of couldn't get enough of it. So one of my early jobs was at a company called Green Order, which at the time was a kind of boutique management consulting firm that was doing a lot of really great work for big corporations like General Electric, and a lot of utilities and others. And so when I was there, I was really focused on commercial real estate. So my biggest client was GE Real Estate, which at the time had a big real estate portfolio. And so I was really learning a lot about commercial real estate structures, and I became really obsessed with this idea of kind of the ESCO, or the performance financing model for commercial buildings. So the idea that you could basically finance energy efficiency improvements based on the expected cash flows of the energy savings that would result from those improvements. And it'd be something that had been around for a long time. I went to a conference one day and I met this guy named John Hirschfeld, who's still a good friend and doing great work in now the single family rental space. And he was a commercial real estate expert, and he basically helped with me and Green Order kind of create this venture, which we called at the time Class Green Ventures, I think, or Class Green Real Estate. And that was just a little small thing. I wasn't involved that much. I just kind of helped get it up and running as kind of a junior analyst. But I found I really liked creating something from nothing, right? You can kind of have an idea, and then the next day you're pitching somebody in a boardroom, and it feels real. And so then, coincidentally, I happened to reconnect with a college friend who was starting a company, which later became Efficiency 2.0. And so I helped build kind of the business side of that business, and kind of jumping in, and found I really liked it, and found that I really kind of enjoyed the process of creation, and kind of just getting my hands dirty.
Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com, or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. Yeah, I think it's really, it's quite exciting, that early stage of coming up with something and just making something out of it. I think probably in particular, or something like that, where it's not just you're not just typing up a website or a blog post or something, right, and getting something going. I have some obviously small projects I work on. Doing this podcast is one of them, right? And it feels good to get something out there. So that is helpful to hear. Could we go a little bit deeper than that, then into kind of the process of going through, hey, I know there's a problem with efficiency, kind of going to the early stage of when you were learning, and now a bit of hands-on experience. What ultimately led you to say, hey, I need to go start a company doing this, because perhaps I can't find a company doing this that I think is doing it well, or whatnot? What was that process like beyond that?
Yeah. So when I was at Efficiency 2.0, you have to, like, context here is, mid-20s, have no idea what I'm doing, have never, we ended up, pivoting the business early on to sell to utilities, had never sold to a utility in my life. I remember the first utility meeting we even scheduled, we showed up an hour late because we got the time zones wrong. Like, it was, it was a mess. Eventually figured it out, got a bunch of big contracts. We sold the company to what's now C3 AI in 2012. But I remember feeling kind of along those, in that kind of last phase of the business, really anxious around the impact that I was making or not making with Efficiency 2.0. So we built a great business, but it was focused on what's called behavioral energy efficiency. So we were basically giving created white label software that we sold to utilities that helped them engage their customers to give them energy saving recommendations around things they could do in their home or their life to save energy and carbon. We gave them feedback on that, and then we gave them rewards for actually saving energy. And you can move the needle around, like, let's say 5% or so kind of energy reductions from doing that, from people doing kind of low or no cost things. But we weren't really tackling the elephant in the room, which were kind of the big physical improvements that we need to really kind of drive our building carbon footprint down to as close to zero as possible. And so to do that, right, you had to start dealing with money. And so what kind of catalyzed me was leveraging the experience I had had at Green Order and learning about the commercial real estate space, and then what I'd learned from Efficiency 2.0 in the residential space in terms of, consumer behavior and what you can do with big data, kind of how to navigate the utility and regulatory, sphere a little bit. And so kind of putting that together, I kind of was like, well, I think that this company that's, now sealed needs to exist because we need a company that can scale kind of the private capital investment in residential efficiency. And I think I know how to make it work, or at least the elements of how to make it work, right? Or that was kind of the ingoing thesis. And really it was, I wanted to see it happen. And I kind of just like became obsessed with the idea. I talked to everyone I know, tried to poke holes in it, tried to find out a reason this definitely wouldn't work. And so when I left C3, basically what happened though very practically is I went to my wife came to me. She's wonderful. And she said, hey, I know you're not going to be able to get this stupid idea out of your system. So I'm going to give you 6 months to go like see if there's any legs on it, if it can get traction. And after 6 months, if it doesn't, I guess your podcast listeners can't see me putting air quotes in the air, then you're going to have to either go get a real job or go to business school. And so I said, okay, great. And as I like to joke now, jokes on her. 10 years later, still kind of chugging along. So that's really what got it started. And, every step of the way, it's always been hard, right? And happy to talk about that. But every step of the way, there was, progress being made, and the kind of core thesis that we had with the business kind of kept getting validated, right? And so that kind of kept me going every step of the way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. This is really good. I think so. Before we get into my next question, which is around the MVP and how you got going, I would like to just make sure we do take a quick pause to say, can you explain to us what Sealed does now?
Yeah.
Kind of just in the very simple terms, and the key aspects of what you're doing, because I know there's a couple things.
Sure. So Sealed, we're a climate tech company. We have a mission to stop home energy waste and electrify all homes. We do that through the design, management, and financing of home weatherization and electrification projects. So that's things like insulation, air sealing, hence sealed, air source heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, smart thermostats, basically anything that improves a home's comfort while reducing the amount of energy that it uses. So we essentially are a direct-to-consumer home energy retrofit company. So we do all of the marketing, all of the sales, all of the contractor coordination, from kind of soup to nuts. The only thing we don't do is the actual work in the home, where we partner with local contractors. And then we put up the capital to install the project. So we'll finance the project up front. And then our customers, the homeowners, only pay us back based on the amount of energy waste that we reduce. So if we invest in a project and the energy waste doesn't go down, they use just as much energy as they did before, then we don't make a dime. So we're kind of putting our money where our mouth is, literally investing in the project. And we found that really increases the trust and accountability that you have with homeowners over this work, which is really important, because most of the kind of work that I was describing is happening in the nooks and crannies of your home, in your attic, in your basement, in your crawl spaces, and often with technology that you may be excited about, but aren't 100% confident is gonna work, like air source heat pumps.
Okay, that's great. That's a really good summary. I want to do one other thing too, is can you break down of those main components, which are the major, how much percentage to each is kind of the energy waste that's going out the walls of the house? Can you break those down for us?
Sure. So if you're looking at kind of if we're talking about the heating and cooling of your home, which is what most of these improvements are impacting, if you do weatherization, that can usually cut down on 20 to 40% of the energy waste that you have for heating and cooling. It depends on how deep you go, right? If you're just insulating one part of your house, that may be on the lower end versus the higher end. And then heat pumps can go much higher. So heat pumps are really this magical device, for anyone who has not heard of them, that move energy rather than create energy. So most fossil fuel heating systems, a boiler or a furnace, you're literally, lighting a fire and burning, we like to say burning dead dinosaurs, right? You're burning fuel in your home. And so at most, at very best, because of the laws of thermodynamics, you can be about 100% efficient, right? And you can't even get to that. Most systems are maybe 80, 90, if you're really efficient, 95% efficient, because there's heat loss when you're doing that. Heat pumps don't burn anything. What they do is they actually attract the heat from the outdoors and bring them in the winter, and do the opposite in the summer, which is literally what an air conditioner does. It basically moves the air from inside to outside during the summer. And then again, what a heat pump does is it also does the opposite in the winter, and it uses refrigerants to retract the heating molecules basically into your home. Because of that, it's actually more than 100% efficient. So you get more than 1 unit of heat for every unit of energy that you put in, because the only energy you need to do is to basically run the refrigerant lines and attract the heat inside. So most air source heat pumps, for example, are on average about 300% efficient, or have what's called a coefficient of performance of 3. And that varies based on time of year and type of heat pump that you get, but it's much more efficient than the heating system. So because of that, you can take your heating and cooling usage and dramatically reduce it, more than 50%, more than 60% in many cases, based on putting those heat pumps together. And the best scenario is when you combine them together, right? So I, for example, got my own home sealed last year. I like to say I'm not just the president, I'm also a customer for any Hair Club for Men 80s ad fans. And looking at my energy usage has been cut by over 50%, and I haven't done all the weather normalization, but pretty sure it's more than 60%. So these improvements can have a really big impact on the amount of energy waste that you reduce.
Hey there, thanks for listening to this episode. If you made it this far, it's likely that you're enjoying the show, so I wanted to ask your help. If you're enjoying it, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share with somebody in the same industry who might find this interesting. And if you're interested in getting summaries of these episodes, go subscribe to our newsletter that comes out on LinkedIn and Substack. Links can be found in the description. Thanks for your help in growing the reach of this show. Okay, interesting. That's really helpful. So I think that's a good place to go back to the business stuff. So, once you got to this point where you had a 6-month timer, essentially, what did you go about doing first? And just walk us through that process from, getting the MVP together, getting financing. What did you do?
Yeah, so did a number of things. The biggest thing I did was customer development, because I think early on, I mean, we had I think we had a sign up at one point at Sealed that said ABCD, always be customer developing, right? And I'm a big believer in that. And so mostly what I did was I talked to anyone and everyone who would talk to me about energy or efficiency issues. So I, spammed everyone I knew to talk to their parents around who were homeowners around how they thought about energy, how they thought about comfort, how they thought about all the issues that we were working with. I was living in Astoria, Queens at the time. So I'd drive out to Long Island, a couple times a week, knock on doors, go, visit homeowners, learn about them. I'd shadow energy audits. I'd go to Penn Station 1 or 2 times a week, and just literally kind of hijack people who were waiting for their train because they had nowhere to go, and ask them a couple questions for things that I was trying to learn. I ran surveys, basically tried to get as much information as possible around how this is going to work. I talked to a lot of other stakeholders in the industry as well. Talked to, finance folks, contractors, utility experts, and basically just trying to really wrap my head around kind of the contours of the problem and making sure that I was thinking about it in the right way, et cetera. So that was kind of the number one thing that I did. I also worked with a lawyer to put together kind of the first draft of the agreement that we used. When we started out, we didn't have any money, right? So we were just reliant on what we called the time our guaranteed savings agreement product. So we would basically not put up any money. The customer would finance the project with a loan or put up capital, but we would basically guarantee a certain amount of energy reductions through a shadow bill with the customer. And then we were betting that they would save more than we were guaranteeing, essentially. So setting up that, and then data. So I basically did kind of a burr with the Long Island, it was called the Long Island Green Homes Program at the time, that had basically collected a lot of data on how different homes in their program had saved energy or used energy before or after. It's actually a really great data set, but it was super messy, right? It was like lots of like hand checked forms and oil delivery records and like faded utility, printouts. So I basically made a deal with them where I would personally clean up all of their data if they would let me have access to that data as part of kind of building our kind of the first version of our analytics to be able to predict energy savings. And they did it. So some days I would just literally sit in my office and just be doing data entry for hours on end to try to make progress on looking at that. So I'm skipping probably a lot of things that I was doing back then, but those were kind of the basics around kind of basic customer development, basic product development, like enough to basically start to put in front of a customer, react to something. So what I would do with the customer development was at first I would just ask questions. And then as I got further in the process, I would put in front of them, react like to this proposal or react to this agreement language that I have. And I would kind of get a sense both from what people told me, as well as their body language, what people were fine with, what excited them, what they were really nervous about, what they wouldn't accept. And you just kind of like triangulate into, the early kind of proto product market fit type things.
So at this point, you were just kind of pitching them to see and get data for yourself. You weren't actually selling the product at the end of the day. You were just kind of saying, hey, what do you think? And then taking the feedback and then going and working on the product before you really brought it to market.
Yeah. So I'd kind of like just say like, hey, would this be something you do? Right. And then they would say yes, no, and whatever they said, I want to know what the reason for that was essentially. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they might say, well, I would do it if X circumstances, were the case, or so you also get a sense of like what really drives people's decision making. And I would also talk to people who did these projects, right? So I would like, again, going on shadowing energy audits was really great because I could see the sales process basically happening, and I could see what the people looked like who wanted to do these projects, what their mentality was, how they thought about the economics of it, how they thought about the value proposition. And so you're kind of trying to talk to a lot of different kinds of people to understand different things about
Mm-hmm.
The different aspects of the product.
Okay, very cool. So as you were doing that, how long did you spend building that kind of understanding and data set before you then said, okay, let me pull together some contractors and go make this happen?
Probably about six months or so. I mean, a lot of things happen kind of in parallel. Like it's never as clean, right? It's like, it's not like, today I've decided I have the perfect agreement and I'm going to go, now pitch this to contractors or what have you. So, but what happened after about 6 months or so was I started getting initially traction with companies that were like bigger contracting companies that seemed interested in the idea. So I figured there was like something here if I got people who'd like been in this space and were some of the bigger players that were interested in this. So started getting interest from, at the time, there was a company called Mark Group, which was they might still exist, but they were basically a UK based group. And they were, they were the biggest kind of insulation companies in the UK, and they'd open up a pretty big branch in the US. And so they were interested. We had some conversations. It was kind of it's kind of difficult though at the early stage too, because if you have a good enough idea, established players will also try to like copy it. So like early on, we also had a lot of these same companies that were either like, they could be partners, they could be competitors. You're not really sure. You're kind of walk this dance between like wanting to signal that this is like really hard to do, but also that it's like simple to execute. So there was a lot of kind of like back and forth a little bit. But I the signal for me was that like really smart people who'd been doing this thought enough of the idea where they were interested in talking and interested in exploring partnerships. So that kind of like made me feel like I'd kind of gotten to the next stage of the kind of company building process.
Okay, very cool. That's quite interesting. When did you, so, you mentioned that this is around the 6 months, which is when your kind of timeline was, your ultimatum, if you will. When did you decide, okay, you know what, there is traction and now I'm going to, pull the trigger to dive deeper into this? Did you go raise money? Did you get a couple contracts in place before you continued on that? Kind of what did that next step look like once you decided that this was right?
Yeah. So, the next step was obviously raising a little bit of money. So, um, in the basically, for exactly when we closed, but basically end of the first year, basically of building the business, raised a little bit of capital from friends and family, and the kind of biggest check was from the lead investor in my last company, Efficiency 2.0, who I'd gotten to know and who'd been a big supporter of efficiency startups and kind of knew me pretty well, and that allowed me to hire a few people and kind of get to the next stage. But it was kind of at that point where it's like, okay, well, it may not work, but like we've got enough where it's worth me continuing to spend time on this.
Okay, got it. Interesting. So now, I guess maybe for people listening, the business really at this point is mostly or not currently, but at this point of time that we're talking about, was mostly just logistics, right? You're going out finding customers, and then you're going out and finding other people to do the work, correct? Initially.
Yeah. So, initially the idea was that we would basically just sell this guarantee through contractors. That was like
Mm-hmm.
the original kind of go to market strategy. That spoiler alert, that didn't work. And then kind of the next iteration of that was we would go get the customer, and then we would basically work with the contractor to actually install the project. So we kind of what we kind of learned was that people like the idea of a guarantee, but it was a new thing and it was a little complicated. And so it was, if something is a little complicated, if you're a contractor selling home improvements, you don't really want to add a new variable to the mix, especially when it's changing all the time, because we were iterating and pivoting and doing all these things. So we kind of realized, at least initially, we really need to sell this directly, right? And the contractors were more than happy to partner with us to install the work, right? And to, in early days, also do the energy audit. But we had to kind of learn how to sell this and what made sense and what didn't make sense. So we started building like a small kind of like direct to consumer marketing operation that was it sounds fancier than it was. It was like going to farmers markets and knocking on doors was kind of the next iteration of our go to market strategy.
Mm-hmm. I think this is something interesting. I'm assuming this was all done largely in the New York area.
Yeah, it was almost all on Long Island. So at one point it felt like we were like employing half of Hofstra at one point to do like grassroots outreach. Shout out to the students of Hofstra. But yeah, it was mostly in Long Island.
Yeah, this is one thing I think it's quite interesting. I noticed when I, obviously being from the middle of nowhere, it was very different when I moved to New York, is that it's such a great place to build a startup, and there's multiple options, what kind of startup you're building because of the ecosystem, and there's just the sheer number of people that you can get a hold of in an easy way.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
okay,
for us, just real quick, for us, Long Island is perfect because it's basically this like geographic land. And my dad's originally from Long Island, so I know to call it the Guyland from him. But it's this just like big, literally long landmass that is just full of houses, right? It's mostly residential, so it's this like great, kind of like petri dish for a business like Sealeds.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Once you started getting traction, what would you say is the milestones that led you to the next phase, and what was that? How you raised up some more money, I'm assuming. Kind of walk us through that process and how you got there, and what was really the key proof point to get more serious investors involved.
Yeah. So, I mean, at each stage, you're kind of proving out a different thing, right? So like early on, at the very early on, it was like, is this an idea that has, any level of traction where, serious people, serious partners, right, are interested in getting involved? Yes. Okay. Can we actually sell this to customers? So we built kind of a small, again, marketing and sales operation. We found we could sell it, but what we found from that was that the guarantee by itself, like, wasn't a strong enough of a value proposition where we felt we could really build a scalable business by itself. So after we kind of figured that out, we said, okay, we need to actually turn this into a financing product, right? Which is kind of, from early on where we wanted to go. We just didn't have the financial resources to do it, or we hadn't figured out enough about the general problem space to kind of do it in the right way. So we worked with with project finance consultant, this guy friend, Colin Kasunik, who's now done a lot of work for Block Power, another big company in this space. We basically worked with him to create this financial product and then go to a bunch of potential funders to basically, stand by it. And we ended up working with the New York Green Bank, which is still a finance partner to us this day. And they actually also really helped us kind of structure it in the right way, because we'd never kind of built a project finance facility before this. So we worked with them. We needed capital to, pay lawyers and kind of get this over the end. So there was some fundraising associated with that, but there was like a clear light at the end of the tunnel to have this financing product, right? And so we kind of got there because that was what all of our customer feedback, all of our customer research was telling us, was we needed to turn this general idea of a guarantee really into a financing product where what it looks like today at Sealed, where we put up the capital and basically get paid back based on by the actual energy reductions. Mm-hmm. Now we got that across the line. And I think probably one of the biggest mistakes I made was not going back at that stage and doing the hard customer development work to see how this would be different with a financing product versus this guarantee product. So we launched the financing product and we were so excited. We're like, all right, up and to the right from here, right? All of our customer data tells us this is what customers want. And it just frankly didn't work at first. And we couldn't figure out why. And we eventually kind of figured out that I won't get into details, but basically the way we had engineered the product was just too complicated, right? And that was largely because we had tried to just glom on the guaranteed savings agreement to this new performance financing agreement. And it was just a little bit different. There were some tweaks we needed to make. So the next stage was basically going way back into customer development and basically just talking to tons of people, our own customers, other homeowners, giving them different ways we could structure it and just getting a much better sense of what was going to resonate. So we basically overhauled the product. Like, big props to the New York Green Bank for letting us, change our contract in a few different ways as part of doing that. But we basically then got to a point where we could sell our product very consistently. And again, we were doing outside sales at this time. So we were going basically door to door, crawling in attics, doing all the kind of like dirty work to get this sold. And so that was kind of the next milestone. But then at that point, we faced a really big existential challenge, which is, how do you bring this to scale, right? So, at the time, the biggest efficiency company who we talked to early on was this company called Next Step Living. And they had just basically gone out of business after raising gobs of VC. And so nobody wanted to fund a outside sales residential efficiency company, right? Even if there was a spin on it and we were doing something a little bit different. And so we basically first tried to sell through contractors, basically contractors as our channel. And that worked a little bit, but it wasn't working fast enough for kind of the traction we needed to demonstrate to be able to continue raising capital and grow. And so honestly, kind of out of desperation, out of like, we have no other options, we started experimenting with outside sales. So basically doing all of the sales remotely, because we're like, well, we can scale this, right? We can hire people to sit in an office. Well, office at the time was we're still full. Hire someone to be at an office and make phone calls, and we can train them and do that aspect of it. And that's much more scalable and kind of capital light than having to pay for trucks and equipment and sending people out to people's homes and all of that. And at the same time, kind of just so happenstance, we'd been developing these utility co-marketing partnerships, and that really hit in a big way. And basically all of this hit at basically the beginning of 2018. And so we had all of these leads, right? And we had a way now, even if it was imperfect, we were still tweaking it to basically take those leads and turn them into cash, right? Because we could basically, talk to them over the phone, educate them on the product, educate them on the work, and then for those customers that were interested in moving forward, we'd then connect them with our contractor partners who would go to the home, do the energy audit, kind of make sure that we had the right scope, kind of finalize all of that, send it back to us, and we'd then basically finalize and close the deal. And by doing that, right, which is largely what Sealed's business looks like today, we kind of like found our core product market fit, right? So that was kind of that was really, I would say, the biggest like inflection point in our growth curve, right? There's a lot of things that went into getting to that point, but from there, then it was about kind of like copying and pasting for a lot of it, right? Which is not easy, by the way, right? Like building a growth engine is a very, very challenging thing to do. We were lucky because a friend of mine, college roommate of mine, actually, who had just left a startup that he'd helped build, who was a great growth mind, a guy by the name of Jeff Fernandez, came in and really helped us kind of build our growth engine kind of from scratch, literally. So we had a lot of talented people, but we were able to build a revenue engine that was able to continue to basically scale. The next roadblock we hit was the limits to relying on utility co-marketing for leads. So, I'd had a background in the utility space. We'd gotten lucky kind of being at the right place at the right time to develop these really, at the time, unique co-marketing partnerships with utilities, where we would pay for the leads, we would pay for the marketing, but we would go through the utility channel. They would send emails. We still have a lot of those live, working with most of the major New York utilities, for example. And it was kind of a win-win because we were helping the utilities meet their energy efficiency goals in a more cost-effective way. But it's really hard to scale utility partnerships of any kind exponentially, right? And so we hit a wall in, kind of late 2019 because we just couldn't grow our lead volume fast enough to basically grow. And then COVID hit. And that was both kind of one of the most challenging times, but also the time that really was another big pivot point, because all of those partnerships shut down for a few months because none of the utilities wanted to promote, somebody going to your home, which made sense, right? And so we kind of doubled down on some efforts that we were making with digital marketing, and we'd hired a brilliant woman who's our head of marketing now, Kalyani Menon, who basically kind of built our digital marketing from scratch. So we basically started figuring out how to get into Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and all of these different channels. And so we started to control our own destiny. So within a couple of years, we went from utilities making up 80-90% of our leads to now it's kind of flipped around where they're still wonderful partnerships and we love working with those utility partners, but it's a fairly small percentage of our lead mix today because we're able to do that. And then the other big thing that happened in 2020 is we introduced our heat pump product, what we call our climate control plan. And that was really important from both an impact perspective, right? Because as we were talking about earlier, to really drive those energy waste reductions, heat pumps are a big driver. And obviously, because we make money based on the amount of energy that's saved, the bigger projects that we do with more energy saved, the more valuable those are to Sealed. So it was good business and good from an impact perspective.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the alignment of the model where you basically are incentivized to make sure that you're getting massive amounts of savings. The more savings, the better the income for you. So I wanted to go a little bit back to clarify a couple things. At what point then, you mentioned it was very difficult to raise VC dollars because I think you said Next Step had gone out of Next Step Living had gone out of business. Once you began getting some of these contracts and leads with utilities and more business organically, did you then go out and raise again? Like, what did that look like, and what was different that time? Was it just about the proof points? Because I'm assuming there's other people building businesses and trying to go through that process of, okay, what do we have to show in order to get your money?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think fundraising is always challenging. I think for our business has always been, I would say, very polarizing. So we were one of the regional winners of very early on of the CleanTech Open Northeast, which is like a clean energy business plan kind of accelerator / competition. And the general, when we were one of the winners, but what feedback we heard was basically for most of the people, we were either the most most favorite company, that we were the company that people were either most excited about or the ones they were least excited about, right? So that's kind of been a lot of the I think both challenge and opportunity that we've had as a business, is that what we're doing is largely kind of considered the holy grail within kind of the energy efficiency, or particularly the residential energy efficiency market. And so people can get very excited about it, but they're also very skeptical because, why can you do it when everyone else has failed, essentially, right? So we've always had a lot of, especially within the industry, skepticism. So I would say early on, most of our money was we raised from people who were not in the clean energy industry, because they were so kind of jaded by people who had tried this kind of model in the past. But once we started getting those proof points, and we started getting kind of very impressive month over month growth and quarter over quarter growth, et cetera, and kind of the growth engine happened, then that opened us up to a whole new class of investors and VCs.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, this is quite fascinating. See, I think a lot of people have very, very different experiences depending on the circumstances with the raise, right? As you mentioned here, it essentially took somebody who didn't already have predetermined ideas in order to write that check. So that is quite fascinating. I think encouraging for people to consider that when you're going out to investors. Who are you going out to? What are their existing thoughts about the space, right? Perhaps you might want to, I don't want to say hoodwink, but you might want to go to somebody who's not as informed, because they might be outside of the loop. They might have a little bit more faith in you versus somebody who's already gotten burned. So that is quite fascinating.
I think more than anything is that sometimes people outside of the industry you're in think differently, as I look at your background poster right now, and they have different pattern matching, right? Because a lot of times folks that have seen industries transformed, or have seen, in their own career or their own industry, things that are parallel to your industry but are a little bit different. So it really depends, and it depends, the macro fundraising environment. It depends on where you are from a traction perspective. But I think that my experience, and I can only speak to kind of the clean energy and energy efficiency space, is that sometimes people in this space get very set in their thinking about certain things. Not everybody, right? I don't want to paint too broad of a picture. And we have a lot of great investors that come from the clean energy space, from both early on and more recently. But it's something that can definitely be challenging. And I think that's not just an investor thing. I think that's also for kind of building the business. I would think one of the things that I've really learned from doing this is that you always have to be a student of history. You always have to learn why things worked or didn't work in the past. Like, don't be totally blinded to what happened. But at the same time, in general, and not in every case, but in general, whenever at Sealed we've done something different than the industry, we've generally been successful. And whenever we've done the same thing because we assume it's just the way that things should be done, because that's how they've always been done, we've not been successful. So you have to really always question the core assumptions, go back to first principles, and really always test your logic around why things are being done the way that they're done. I think we're, happy to talk about it later, but I think we're seeing that right now, for example, in some of the disruption that I think is coming from the IRA, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting. To me, the question of who your investors are and how you pitch that is super important for people to make sure their businesses get running. We've talked a lot about growing the business. I think I'd like to switch gears a little bit we can maybe shift to what you just mentioned and alluded to, is a little bit about the future innovations and things coming. Kind of give us your thoughts on where this space is going, what you're excited for in the next year to 3 years.
Yeah. So the way that I think about the energy efficiency and electrification challenge generally, and I think this applies to a lot of the different sectors, but I'll talk about the residential sector because that's the one that I know best. It's a big problem. There's a lot of homes, right? There's over, basically 100 million homes in the US alone. And really, to leverage the capital that you need, I think there's three big categories that we think about in terms of being able to drive value and drive private capital. So the one is, we've kind of already talked about today, which is, reducing energy waste, basically taking the money that would normally go to, like to say coal companies and Middle Eastern dictatorships, right? And investing that in your home, right? Investing that in the comfort and quality of life of your home, reducing drafts, increasing air quality, things like that. The second is actually exactly that, which is quality of life. So with Sealed's financing product, for example, we put up the capital, customers pay us back based on their energy reductions, but depending on the project economics, most of our customers actually pay a higher total kind of energy budget after the project than before. So between their energy bills go down, but between what they pay their utility companies and what they pay Sealed after the project, it's usually at least a little bit higher. So, if you get a comfort project, maybe you're paying $30 to $50 a month more than you would otherwise. And so the thing that we kind of tell our customers is, is your comfort worth $30 to $50 a month, right? And so that quality of life benefit, right, we think is very valuable. And that's actually what we really focus on more than anything, is improving quality of life. So, you don't buy a couch to save money, right? Or to save money on your energy bills. You buy a couch because you want to be more comfortable in your couch, right? And the good news about a lot of these energy efficiency and electrification improvements is they not only stop energy waste, but they also improve your quality of life, right? And there's value in that. And then the third category, which is sometimes the trickiest, or I would say oftentimes the trickiest, is what I'll generally call externality value, right? So this is the idea where if I reduce my energy use at peak times, right, I'm actually saving money, not just for myself, but for all of my neighbors and the kind of system worldwide, because of the way that, the electricity system is run. There's also externalities related to carbon and health benefits, both at the kind of macro level and at the kind of regional and neighborhood level. So there's a lot of these kind of like externality values that oftentimes are really tough to capture in either price signals that the utility are sending and or incentives or other kind of programs that they use to give to you. So for example, if my utility, right, gave me a rebate to put in insulation in my house, shout out to Eversource. But the way that the sizing of that incentive was set didn't take into account the reduced peak demand that's going to occur from my now electrified home, right? So there's a lot of like factors that a lot of these incentive programs have a tough time bringing into the mix. And the biggest kind of challenge, again, just using the same analogy from before, biggest elephant in the room is that a lot of people just don't believe that those energy reductions are real enough for grid planners to rely on them. So energy efficiency kind of has this existential problem where it's, by most metrics, the largest carbon reduction as well as energy resource that we have in the world and in our country, but you can't see it, right? It's literally the lack of something. So it's always really had this challenge of measurement and being real and how that works. So happy to talk more about kind of what that means, I think, for the IRA and kind of changing paradigms. But that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we as an industry face generally, and something that Sealed's kind of working on right now, to try and change, to make energy efficiency move from what's kind of historically been a compliance exercise by the utilities and by states to one that is a true clean energy resource that utilities and the private sector can invest in, just the way that they invest in solar, wind, and other energy resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be glad to have you touch briefly. We are getting pretty close on time, but I would be keen to hear just the key aspects of when you mentioned the IRA aspect of what is it really changing? Is it massively impacting your business model and just kind of your general things that you'd like to bring up there?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things in the IRA, obviously, but the program that we're most excited about is this $4 billion program called the Homes Program. And the Homes Program is an incentive program that basically gives incentives based on the amount of energy that a home is going to reduce, and that can be two different ways. One is called the modeled pathway, and one is called the measured pathway. I won't talk about the modeled pathway. It's a pretty kind of straightforward way of estimating savings, but most models, in life in general, including in energy, are usually wrong to one extent or another. What's exciting is that the legislation enables this measured pathway, where for the first time, really at any sort of scale, companies like Sealed can be paid incentives by the government in this case based on the actual measured energy reductions. So pretty much all incentive programs today are not actually paid based on how much energy you actually save. It's based on how much energy they think you're going to save based on some sort of calculations, which again are usually pretty wrong. And so what this does is it creates a nationwide framework that every state can adopt, to basically turn all of the homes that receive these incentives effectively into a virtual power plant, because those incentives can be sized not just based on the actual measurement of the energy reductions, but also on things like time, location, and greenhouse gases, which is a key input to, again, making energy efficiency be what's usually instead called a kind of demand side demand flexibility or demand side resource, to basically be able to meet our energy needs. So this program basically creates the framework. Now, every state has to make the decision to use the money in that way, but it creates the framework, it creates the possibility to basically, again, transform energy efficiency from this compliance exercise to a real clean energy resource. And so what Sealed is doing to try to make that happen, or to try to catalyze that market, is by sharing a lot of what we've learned from measuring savings for over 10 years now, and what that looks like on the ground, and how market actors like Sealed can really inject private capital into this approach and be able to help scale it up in many ways. Now, we think this is not something that is uniquely something that is unique to Sealed. We think this actually is a big market creation opportunity for policymakers, but I think really understand the power of measuring energy savings based on kind of building a business around it for the last decade.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite fascinating. You point out, if I try to summarize that, the real key point is that most of these existing or former policies have been related to something that may happen. It's kind of a projection, which is often wrong, or almost always wrong, probably. But this is based off of actual measured reduction. And going back to the point you've made from the very beginning, which is energy efficiency is the biggest thing we can do to solve climate change for this kind of emissions aspect, but where there's no incentive to do it, right? So it's kind of, to me, it kind of has the same same vibes as when solar was a little bit incentivized to get going. It got the industry going, and then before you know it, it's off and running. And it just takes a little bit of that catalyst to get people going, because now they'll realize, hey, they may not necessarily think about it in the long term, but they're like, hey, there's a money on the table initially. Let me go get that. And then later on down the road, they're going to look back and think, people as a whole will look back and think, wow, why didn't we do that sooner, right? Because it's going to have those really positive impacts once it's done on scale. So that is really fascinating. I do have one more big question I want to get to before we end here, which is, I'm kind of curious, given that Sealed has grown pretty well and has had good success, what has your view been on talent? How do you approach talent acquisition?
I mean, I think it's at the end of the day, probably the most important thing as you grow a business. The first C-suite officer that we hired was a chief people officer. Wonderful woman named Angela. Um, and we really put a premium on everything related to people. So, recruiting and hiring, uh, everything related to, internal systems. Especially, you have to remember too, a lot of our headcount growth started happening during COVID. So we also had to figure out how to, like many companies, had to figure out how to become a remote company as we were kind of like going through kind of hyper growth mode. So that creates, you have to use a lot of create a lot of processes and have the right have the right guidelines in place, have the right support system, make sure we're providing the right tools to our team members. So it's really important. It's really hard. It's really hard to do, but it's something that's really important to kind of who we are as a company.
Have you found anything in particular around getting that brand built, so that you don't rely heavily on outside talent acquisition sources and be able to kind of get people? Because I've seen many people in the show talk about attracting certain kind of well-known people. This is usually in more technical startups, but just kind of bringing in the right people initially that end up catalyzing the big growth parts of the business. Any particular tips you have for founders on that side of things?
I think for that sense, it's really important. I'd say that's mostly important at the like executive hiring level. So for example, we brought in a product leader who's now our chief product officer, Paul Zexer, who had previously been at Angie's List and Angie's List Home Advisor. And so he was able to very quickly kind of build a team and build up our kind of product and engineering and design and data infrastructure. We had some folks kind of doing some of those roles, but he really kind of accelerated. So I think the biggest thing kind of I learned from that is when you're hiring executives, it's not just about what they can do as ICs, right? It's really, frankly, much more about what they can do in terms of building a team and building a function, right? And that's kind of a skill set in and of itself. So when you're going through the recruiting process and when you're trying to find the right people, you want to do it. But honestly, I would also say working with executive recruiters in many cases is also, depending on how fast you need to move, is just really important.
Very good. Well, I mean, this has been, I think, really a great episode. I'd love to hear all of the tips and the process. I think to me, I just find it quite fascinating that these quite complex businesses can be built at a pretty, I am not say easy, but the MVP is not rocket science, right? And I think it's difficult. You look at Sealed now; it has a very nice, crisp type of view on the market and how it's perceived. But obviously, there's a time, at the beginning when it's kind of just all building the plane as you're taking off, right? So, I really appreciate you coming on. This is great. Any final asks for the audience, or things you'd like to request for people to do and follow up?
I mean, obviously, we're out to the people talent. If there is a job open that we have that you're interested in, please come and apply to Sealed. We're always looking to add good folks to our team and to kind of build the good word. And beyond that, I would just say, and kind of to your last point, for all of all of your listeners that are building businesses, I think, the number one advice I would give, just going back to the beginning, is customer development, right? More important to me than building software, more important than, building high fidelity, prototypes of anything, is really doing the important but hard work of deep listening. And I think that like deep listening is something that can be hard for a lot of entrepreneurs that, want to move fast and by their nature are very impatient. I consider myself to have that vice. But that, I think, is the biggest thing that I've learned again and again is the most important driver of success, is that really deep listening, and really understanding your customers and the market ecosystem that you're in. And so that would be the thing that, I would prioritize over anything else.
Very good. Awesome. Well, this has been, again, really fun. Super excited to see where you guys continue to grow. And we'll have to have you on again in maybe a couple years and see how things are going.
Sounds good. Thanks, Alice.